Welcome to Case Western Reserve University School of Law. The audience is filled not just with students, but also with many practitioners and academics from around the country who have braved the windy skies of Cleveland to be here today to really witness an extraordinary event. I'm Michael Scharf, the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center here at the law school. The Cox Center was established in 1991, and it is the center of many activities related to international law, and it works together with two other institutes, the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy and the U.S.-Canada Law Institute. Thanks to the generous endowments of the Gun Foundation and other benefactors, CASE in the last 15 years has developed one of the most ambitious international law programs of any law school in the world. We now have over 45 specialty courses in international law, including 5 different labs where our students do work directly for the international criminal tribunals around the world, for the U.S. military commissions, and for the World Bank and the IMF. In addition, we sponsor numerous international conferences, expert meetings, debates, and lectures like this one throughout the year. And we provide grants for over 30 of our students every summer who go around the world and work for international organizations and NGOs. We also run a special summer institute for global justice in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and a spring break international business association program in the Cayman Islands. Well, in 2004, the Cox Center established the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center International Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. Quite a mouthful, but it is quite an award. Selected by the case law faculty who are associated with the Cox Center, the award recognizes a distinguished individual every year who has made a historic impact on peace and justice. The award has been referred to in press reports as Cleveland's version of the Nobel Peace Prize. And past recipients have included Hans Corell, the UN Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs, and Philippe Kirsch, the judge and president of the Permanent International Criminal Court. It is now my pleasure to introduce Gary Simpson, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, who will introduce our Cox Center lecturer and present this year's Frederick K. Cox International Law Center International Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. Dean Simpson.
Thank you. I'm really honored, but also personally delighted to be introducing Judge Thomas Buergenthal, the recipient this year of the Cox Center International Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. I had the good fortune to meet Judge Buergenthal at the very start of my teaching career. When I began teaching at the University of Texas, Judge Buergenthal actually at that time, that first year, was a visiting professor at the University of Texas from State University of New York at Buffalo, and even more so than any of the permanent faculty there, which he became within 6 months. He really provided mentoring to me at the start of my career that really is a model for what faculty should be doing for new faculty. So I've been indebted to him over the years for all of the errors he rescued me from early on, and really just for providing a model to me for what someone should be doing in academia. Judge Buergenthal has really had a remarkable life and career. He is a Holocaust survivor, and I seem to recall him telling me when we were at Texas, I believe the youngest person to survive concentration camps. He immigrated to the United States as a teenager, received his law degree from NYU, an LLM and SJD from Harvard Law School, and he worked his way up to what is really the most prestigious judgeship in the world. I mentioned to the faculty the other day that I was writing for one of our endowed lectures. I was writing to Justice Ginsburg in hopes of trying to get her to speak, but I said whether we do or not, we've really done at least as well, if not better, with our guest here today. Judge Buergenthal is presently the American judge on the 15-member International Court of Justice located in The Hague. That court, also known as the World Court, is the judicial organ of the United Nations. It issues advisory opinions such as last year's case involving the Israeli security wall, and it decides controversial cases between countries such as the pending case involving allegations that Serbia is responsible for genocide in Bosnia. That's scheduled to be decided in the next few weeks. Before becoming a judge on the World Court, Judge Buergenthal held a number of important international positions. He was president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, was one of the first appointees to that court. He chaired the UN Truth Commission for El Salvador, and he was a member of the UN Human Rights Committee. Previously, he was dean of American University Law School. That was immediately after his 5 years at Texas. And he was later director of the International Rule of Law Center at George Washington University Law School. He is one of the most distinguished scholars in international law, a number of award-winning books, many articles to his name. He serves as an honorary president of the American Society of International Law. When he was at Texas as a visiting professor, I remember speaking to Michael Reisman, who was my professor at Yale Law School and really esteemed international law scholar, and I told him that Judge Buergenthal was a visiting professor, and you know, I was sure he'd read much of his scholarship. He said, well, his scholarship is tremendous. He said, but he's much more than that. This is someone who is going to be in some judicial or statesman position. He really transcends academia, and he's certainly proven that through the years. So I want to present him now with the Cox International Law Center Humanitarian Award, and I'd ask him to come forward now. Thank you.
Since my wife is here, I have to give it to her. Dean, it's really a pleasure to be here at your law school and to call you Dean just as you're starting. I think all of you should be delighted and pleased to have Gary Simpson as your dean. He's not only a truly distinguished scholar and teacher, but he's also a wonderful human being, and I can tell you that is the most important part in a dean. The rest, many of us can be, but to be a good, outstanding human being is something the faculty needs, and you're all very lucky. I should also say that I was going to start out by telling you what a wonderful job this law school is doing in the international field, but Professor Sharp has already done anything that I could have done, and probably better. But I should tell you that I wish I could have been a student in the law school that had the activities that you have here today. It's just marvelous. It's true. He doesn't exaggerate. It's really one of the most exciting activities in the international law field, and those of you who are part of it are very lucky to have this opportunity. I am, of course, very, very honored to receive the award. Those who preceded me are very distinguished international lawyers, and I hope I can live up to it, but I'm particularly pleased to receive the award from the dean, who is an old friend, and I was saying to him as the picture was being taken that it is a picture that's about 27 years due, because that was the last time we saw each other. And Professor Sharp I see almost every year. He comes with a group of students to the International Court of Justice, and of course if you know him, you know that you can never say no to him, so I always meet with the students. Well, nothing is free in this world, and I'm told that if you give get an award, you have to speak. This is why you all came here, I suppose. Well, you saw my topic. Basically, I'm going to speak about truth commissions, but let me introduce the subject the way it was introduced to me. In November of 1991, while attending a conference in Norway, I received a call from the office of the UN Secretary General in New York. The caller explained that the Secretary General wished to name me to the United Nations Truth Commission for El Salvador, which was just in the process of being established, and the caller wanted to know whether I would accept. As I was listening to this telephone call from New York, I looked out of the window in Oslo from the conference center where we were meeting, and the icy rain that had started when I got there continued, and my cold was getting worse and worse as the days dragged on, and all I could think about was the tropical weather in El Salvador. So I immediately accepted the Secretary General's offer, dreaming of this marvelous weather, and I didn't ask any of the questions one is supposed to ask on those occasions. That's how I became a member of the UN Truth Commission for El Salvador. I should also tell you, while we're telling stories, that the way I became a judge on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was I was teaching in Texas at the time, and I received a call from somebody who identified himself as the Costa Rican ambassador to the United States. And he said that Costa Rica would be very honored if I would accept the nomination to the newly created Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I'd been teaching a seminar at Texas on human rights, and I kept telling my students that because the U.S. hadn't ratified the convention, no American would ever be a judge on the court. And so I was sure that one of my students was doing the calling. And so I said to him, Ambassador, I'm of course honored, but could you leave me your telephone number? I have to speak to my wife, and we have to make all these important decisions. And I immediately checked to make sure it was the Costa Rican embassy, and that's how I ended up on the Inter-American Court. Well, in a similar way, I ended up on the Truth Commission for El Salvador. It's really turned out to be one of the most important, albeit heart-rendering, assignments I've ever had. The peace agreements between the government of El Salvador and the insurgents, which was concluded in 1991, put an end to a civil war that lasted 12 years and that had brutalized this small Central American country. The conflict had caused the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Among them, you probably know the name, Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador. There had been some large-scale massacres, including the massacre of El Mozote, where more than 500 people, among them many women and children, were killed by government forces. But the government did not have a monopoly on human rights violations. The insurgents, too, were guilty of many serious violations of human rights. All in all, it is probably true, and it's a little similar to what's happening right now, that many more innocent human beings than combatants became the victims of the conflict in El Salvador. Our Truth Commission consisted of 3 members: the former President Betancourt of Colombia, former Foreign Minister Figueredo of Venezuela, and me. Some people who knew that I'd served on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights said jokingly that the commission was composed of 2 politicians and a judge who wasn't supposed to keep the politicians honest. Our mandate required us to investigate all major human rights violations that had been committed in El Salvador during its civil war, and to make recommendations for possible reconciliation in the country. Now, immediately on taking office, the UN, with our assistance and with and the role we played, hired an executive director for us and a staff of some 25 young lawyers, sociologists, and forensic anthropologists from various countries in Latin America, the US, and Europe. And we then, almost immediately, once we had our staff together, we moved into offices in San Salvador. Note that we had no Salvadorans, not on the staff and not on the commission. We were supposed to be a truly international commission, and in a moment I'll explain why. We spent the first few weeks in El Salvador meeting with the political and civic leadership in the country, the leaders of the guerrilla movement, editors of the country's leading newspapers, media outlets, church and labor representatives, military commanders, NGO representatives, and so on and so on. These meetings were really designed to get a sense of what people thought about the past, what their attitude was, and really we wanted to get a pulse of what was happening, had been happening in El Salvador, and what their reaction was, what advice we could get from them. And of course, it was also a way in which we could introduce ourselves to the leadership of the country. Now, to begin our fact-finding efforts, we flooded the country with announcements inviting the population to provide the Truth Commission with information about what has happened to their families, to them, to friends during the conflict. Besides sending out our staff into the countryside to interview witnesses, we traveled to various massacre sites where we again interviewed the survivors, and we also visited the various spots where our forensic anthropologists were working. And we also visited various regions of the country where much of the fighting had taken place. We subpoenaed military officers and guerrilla commanders and examined them on their activities during the conflict. We also sought information from the U.S. government, which you know was strongly supported the Salvador government during that period. We wanted to get information from the U.S. government, and later on, if there are questions, I can tell you how that went. Now, during the first 3 months of our investigation, we had very little success in getting much information. People were afraid to testify, particularly against the military or security forces, because the government which had conducted the war was still in power, and its military and police infrastructure was still intact. Also, the insurgents still had control in their strongholds in the countryside, and did not really look very kindly on anyone who was willing to testify that they killed and tortured people. Both sides, of course, had good reason not to tell us anything. And people were scared, not only scared to testify, but they also did not believe that our findings would be honest, because they had a long history of the government establishing investigatory commissions under pressure from the United States, which never really produced any findings of anything that had happened. That meant that we had to convince the population that we were serious and that we would present an honest report, and that isn't really easy in a 8 months period when you have to undertake this type of investigation. We also realized at that point that if we wanted to get any information, we had to provide total confidentiality to anybody who testified before us. That meant that we often had to have clandestine meetings with various important people or witnesses who would testify against either the commanders of the guerrillas or against military commanders. It was quite a cloak and dagger operation. I should tell you, I spent an almost entire period under heavy UN bodyguard in El Salvador, and I always thought it would be exciting. It's not. It's a terribly unpleasant situation where you can't even go to the bathroom until somebody goes in and checks it out for you. And it wasn't a very safe place to operate. Fortunately, nothing really, except a few scary announcements, nothing really happened to any of us. Gradually, our efforts began to bear fruit, and at the end of the first 3 months, people began to talk. And more witnesses started to come forward. Somehow we had convinced them that we meant business, and also, of course, we had guaranteed the confidentiality, and that helped a great deal. At the end of the 8-month period, which was assigned to us, we presented our findings to the UN Secretary General, describing really horrendous events that had taken place in that small country. We dealt with the causes of the conflict and indicated which side, the government or the guerrillas, was responsible for each of the serious violations which we had investigated. Wherever we had the necessary evidence, we identified the individuals who committed these violations. In other words, we named names, and that was a first. And naming names was something that a lot of these people were terribly afraid of. We also recommended various measures that we hoped would lead to reconciliation. Now, before I served on the Truth Commission for El Salvador, I really knew very little about truth commissions. And that's why I gave you this little introduction, because it was really what I learned when I started was what I just told you what truth commissions do. What I didn't know at all was where truth commissions fit into the institutional framework of human rights mechanisms. So let me take a few minutes and address that issue. Over the years, as you know, the international community has created a large number of institutions for dealing with human rights violations. At one end of the spectrum are international human rights tribunals. They try states for violations of international human rights committed or tolerated by their governments. At the other end of the spectrum are international criminal tribunals. And here, as you know, Professor Sharp, of course, has done some magnificent work, and you should see what he has done. It's one of the few people who's really done magnificent work in that field, both practical and theoretical. Now, the task of international criminal tribunals is to try individuals charged with large-scale violations of human rights that constitute international crimes and give rise to individual responsibility. The difference, of course, is that the human rights tribunals only try governments and not individuals. The criminal courts try individuals for crimes against humanity, crimes, genocide, and war crimes, among others. At this time, there exist only 3 human rights courts in the world: the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court, and the newly established Inter-African Court on Human and People's Rights. As a matter of fact, the judges, that court was inaugurated this June. In addition to these 3 regional courts, as yet, incidentally, after all these years, we still don't have a universal international court of human rights. A UN court does not exist. There are, however, numerous international and regional institutions of a quasi-judicial, investigatory, and reporting character. Among them, the UN Human Rights Committee and the new UN Human Rights Council that deal with charges against government. The existing international mechanism for trying individuals charged with massive violations of human rights and humanitarian law, that is to say, those violations that create an individual responsibility that are international crimes, consists of one permanent international criminal court, which has been created only recently with its seat in The Hague, and a handful of ad hoc tribunals. It took, incidentally, Nuremberg was the first international criminal court. It wasn't a permanent court. And since Nuremberg, to establish a permanent court, it took until, 2004, I think, or 2003. It took that long to get a court established. It now sits in The Hague. It still doesn't have very much business. The ad hoc judicial bodies were created to deal with international crimes that were committed prior to the establishment of the permanent tribunal, or to try crimes that don't come within the jurisdiction of the permanent tribunal. And you probably know the two best-known ad hoc international criminal tribunals, the one for the former Yugoslavia and the one tribunal for Rwanda, but there are a number of others as well. The Yugoslav tribunal sits in The Hague, as does the criminal court, as does the International Court of Justice. So we've got, it's known as the judicial capital of the world, at least that's what the Dutch wanted to be known as. Now, where do truth commissions fit into this entire picture? In terms of their functions, truth commissions stand halfway between international human rights bodies and international criminal tribunals, for they deal both with human rights violations committed by governments and by individuals. But they are neither judicial nor quasi-judicial bodies. Truth commissions are fact-finding bodies set up for the specific purpose of investigating serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law committed in a country during an internal armed conflict or a particularly repressive regime. Their mandates differ depending upon the nature of the conflict they are charged with investigating. Some truth commissions are empowered to assign individual or group responsibility for serious human rights violations. That is to say, naming names like we did in El Salvador. Others are denied that power. As a matter of fact, most of them don't have that power or don't make use of the power. As a rule, truth commissions are also mandated to propose compensation to the victims and to recommend measures that are designed to bring about national reconciliation. And national reconciliation is very important in these conflicts because they're usually one form or another of a civil war type conflict. Now, some truth commissions have been authorized to recommend prosecution of major offenders. Others have been empowered to recommend immunity from prosecution if the offenders confess their guilt and ask for forgiveness. And as you probably know, that was the case with the South African Truth Commission that, in fact, had that mandate. Now, three different types of commissions have come into being over the years. National truth commissions, mixed commissions, and international commissions. The best-known national truth commission was, of course, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But there were two others, namely, that are also very well known and were very important and preceded the South African one, which was, in fact, based on the experience of these others. And that was, one of them was established in Argentina following the Dirty War, and the other one in Chile when their dictator, when Pinochet was basically voted out or thrown out. Now, the best-known mixed truth commission was the Guatemalan Historical Clarification Commission, and it had this very strange composition. It consisted of a foreign chairman. In this case, it was a very distinguished German professor of international law, who had the right to select two other Guatemalans to serve with him. In other words, they were not selected by Guatemala or by the parties to the conflict, but by the chairman. That's quite unusual. Truly international commissions, like the Salvadoran one, are quite rare. And as a matter of fact, before we came into being, there had been no experience with such commission. Now, what are the advantages or disadvantages of having either a national mixed or international truth commission? The question cannot really be answered in the abstract, since it will depend on the individual country and on its political climate. A national commission established by consensus between all the major political groups in the country will, as a rule, enjoy national legitimacy and be able to count on broad support for its findings and recommendations. But where such consensus is lacking and the composition of the commission is controversial, it will lack the necessary credibility to come up with a report that will be accepted and that will be at all useful or make a difference. The establishment of an international commission will frequently make sense only for a small country where the population continues to be totally polarized. Here it may be difficult to find even a small group of nationals of the country the population would regard as nonpartisan. And that was the situation in El Salvador, and that explains why they decided that the only thing that would work in their country would be a truly international commission that would have a credibility and would not be seen as to be partial. Mixed commissions have the advantage that their foreign members will be able to draw on their national colleagues for information for the history of the country. But mixed commissions also have the same disadvantage that national commissions have. For unless their national members are seen by the population as being truly nonpartisan, the commission will have difficulty in gathering information it needs to prepare the reports, because people will be afraid that if they belong to one group or to the other group, that information, as to say who testified and told what, would be leaked to the various groups, and the witnesses would find that they had suddenly disappeared. Now, truth commissions exercise what I would call macro fact-finding functions. They investigate conflicts that produce large-scale violations of human rights and humanitarian law of the type that I described with regard to the Salvadoran Commission. International criminal courts, by contrast, engage in what I would call micro fact-finding functions. They deal with facts that concern the rights and obligations of specific individuals. Depending upon the context, a truth commission can provide reliable information about widespread violations of human rights, including genocide, disappearances, extrajudicial executions, torture and rapes, conditions in detention camps, and massacres. It can identify the military or insurgent units responsible for these acts. Truth commissions can also explore the causes of a given conflict and provide a comprehensive historical overview of the events that led to the conflict, which is something that is very important, because very often the conflict continues in the discussion of who caused what. So you still have this, for example, in the former Yugoslavia. You've got a continuous discussion about, no, they did it first, they did that. If you have a truth commission, and if they prepare a report that is credible enough, you, in effect, are able, or hopefully able, to end that discussion and to suddenly come up with history books that all write the same thing. Otherwise, you end up with history books that write different stories about what happened, and the conflict continues to simmer, and you wait until it starts up again. I've never figured out how to get my pages not to stick, but anyway. Now, international criminal courts play a much more limited, but no less important role. Their function is to establish individual criminal responsibility and impose appropriate punishment. And these measures have very important symbolic values. They exact retribution, stigmatize the conduct that resulted in the punishment, and serve as a deterrent by warning those who might at some point or another think of doing what had been done, to let them know that there are certain consequences that are going to be attached. That is to say, they send a message also that the international community considers the acts committed to be criminal, it considers it politically unacceptable and morally reprehensible. And that's what courts, criminal courts, can do, and can do very effectively. Now, in the rarest of cases, though, are international criminal courts, whether criminal or human rights court, able to provide that historical, comprehensive historical overview that I was speaking about before. International criminal courts are also not in a position to try more than a limited number of individuals. For example, in Rwanda, we're told that between 50,000 to 100,000 individuals participated in the commission of genocide. No international court can try that many people. It's impossible. So you need to have some other vehicle to deal with this problem. And trying is not always necessary to put an end to to bring about reconciliation. And because the focus, of course, is person-specific, the approach, the facts must of necessity be much narrower, and the product of what the court, the findings of the court are much narrower than what truth commissions can provide. But truth commissions are not judicial bodies. And they lack the power to try, they lack the power to convict, and to sentence persons accused of criminal offenses. A truth commission is able to make factual findings based on its investigation, and given that power, it can identify individuals responsible for criminal acts, but only a court can try them and impose the required criminal sanctions. Frequently, though, truth commission's findings can settle unresolved political controversies, and that may be extremely important, and in many ways, if it is done well, can be the most important function that truth commissions can perform. Which is something that leads me to feel, and I feel very strongly about that, we can have a discussion about it, that it would be very useful in situations of this type always to have a court and a truth commission working together or in tandem, have the court try the most important offenders and have truth commissions investigate the various causes that led to the conflict that resulted in so many violations of human rights. I felt, for example, that it would have been useful in Germany if there hadn't only been Nuremberg, but also if there had been a truth commission early that had looked at the causes. How was it possible that this happened in a country that prided itself on being one of the most civilized countries in the world? There are other examples. I think, who knows, if a truth commission had been established early enough in Iraq, what the outcome might have been, what the findings could have been. Anyway, we can discuss all of these issues. But let me now turn to truth commissions in terms of their human impact, the human impact on those of us who serve on truth commissions and to the people, what it does to people. First of all, I should tell you that what surprised me the most in El Salvador when I was sitting there and we were interviewing witnesses, and we knew very often who these people were, what they had done, and some of them even admitted what they had done. But never once did I hear anybody say, I'm terribly sorry that this happened. Never once. It was always un error, an error, a mistake. Never, it's terrible that I could have done this. Never. This just didn't come into it. I was shocked, I must say. I've always thought that if you've done something terrible, something in you would say, I'm sorry. It never happened. The other thing that I found, and somehow that supports my own feeling from my own experience, is that the victims are never all that eager to see. They're not filled with hatred. They don't necessarily want people to be tried. What they want is they want an admission of guilt. That this is what happened. I'm sorry that it happened. And that's all they are interested in. And they're interested in something else. And we saw this over and over again. They're interested in, if they know that the story is safe with you, they're interested in telling you their story. What happened to them? What happened to the family? Because oftentimes in these regimes, not only were their brothers, fathers, sisters taken away and never to be seen again, but you weren't even allowed to talk about it, because then you would end up being in the same position. They wanted to be able to talk about it, to say this is what happened. And they wanted to be able to tell their children, who thought their father may have been a criminal because the police took him away, that the ones who were the criminals were the ones who took him away, and not your father or your brother. So this talking about it creates a catharsis that is critical in these situations. To me, one of the most moving experiences in El Salvador were two women who came in once and said they wanted to tell their story. And it turned out that one of them was a Danish woman, and the other one was a Salvadoran woman, and they had met finally at the end of the conflict. And what had happened was, and I now no longer remember who was the boy and who was the girl, but anyway, they met, and the Danish part of the couple joined the Salvadoran in El Salvador. They were captured by the national police and never heard from again, executed as guerrillas. The mothers had never met, and here they came, they had met, and they came and they talked about what had happened. They didn't want anything else. They just wanted somebody to listen and have it written down that this is what happened. That's what people want in that context, in that situation. I had the same experience, for example, when with the Jesuits. There were 7 Jesuits who were killed. 6 or 7 Jesuits were executed by government forces towards the end. The Jesuits didn't want anything else but let them say what had happened to them. And incidentally, there, I witnessed something which I will never forget. You probably all know about Archbishop Romero, because there's a movie made. And when I came into the house where the Jesuits had been executed, one of the Jesuit fathers, not who had survived, had been away in the countryside at the point, pointed to a portrait of the Archbishop Romero, and I saw that the glass was broken and there was a hole. And he said, not only did they come and kill the Jesuits, but on their way out to the courtyard, when they dragged the Jesuit fathers out, they shot at the picture of the Archbishop, whom they had killed a few years earlier. Those are the type of problems you deal with. And this is where, if you can somehow provide some solace by allowing people to speak about it, can be much more useful than criminal trials, although I believe that you need to try the leaders, but it's also important to do something for the people who really suffered during many of these conflicts. That's what truth commissions can do. Thank you. Glad to answer questions.
We have to wait for the microphone.
Oh.
I guess I'll start us off while everybody else is thinking about the questions they have. One of the most controversial things about the El Salvador Truth Commission's decision to name names is the fact that the people who were named had the sanction of notoriety, and they were not able to come in and cross-examine the witnesses against them or have any of the other kind of protections that a criminal defendant would have had. What is your answer to that criticism?
Certainly that was one of the criticisms. First of all, we should know how we try to deal with this subject. We knew, number one, that as soon as we would issue our report, there would be a total amnesty. So there would be no trials whatsoever. That had been predicted by the Chief Justice at the time, who basically told us that's what he was going to do. So we knew, and so we wanted to make sure that at least there was something left from our finding. How did we deal with the evidence? We developed a scheme for weighing evidence, and we concluded that we would only name names if the proof was about 95% convincing to us. We had 75, 50%, and 95% was our basis for deciding to name names. Of course, they didn't have a chance to cross-examine witnesses because, of course, many of them would have killed the witnesses shortly thereafter. And we knew that was a problem. you also have to remember that due process of law is a relative concept. It's not something that it's always the same. It's relative in the sense that you try to balance the interests. And here the interest was the protection of the rights of the individual on the one hand, and the interest of the community in finding out who did what. Also, we were not a court. We didn't convict them. Ours was at most an indictment. So all of this talk about people who say you couldn't have named names because they didn't have due process. They had the best due process we could come up with under the circumstances. And we did all of that balancing. And I can tell you, the other side of the thing was that I was accused, and my colleagues were accused in the Washington Post, that we didn't name some of the people who had been financing the death squads in El Salvador, and that there must have been some conspiracy, somebody had gotten to us, why we didn't name them. The answer was that I was not convinced that the people who were pointed out to us as having been the financiers were in fact the financiers, and I felt I couldn't sign off on something unless I was 95% sure, and I wasn't. So you have these problems, and you have to balance under the circumstances. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Buergenthal. We are honored.
Thank you.
My question relates to the factor of time. When you talk about the Truth Commission in El Salvador, and you mentioned, of course, the Truth Commissions in Argentina and Chile, which inspired, to some extent, the Truth Commission or Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, we're talking about relative short periods of time. What I have in my mind and heart as I ask you this question is Spain, the Civil War in Spain, where you have, in 1939, the Civil War comes to an end, you have a world war, then you have a dictatorship that continues since 39 to 75 when Franco dies. I have been in Spain a number of times since the fall of Franco, and my impression is that no one talks about, partly because time, remember my first point is time, right. Merciless time, isn't it merciless? Time has no mercy. It continues, it moves on. And they don't want to talk. They don't want to talk. And the crimes committed by both sides during the Civil War were so great, silence, not talk as catharsis, but silence. And in my mind and heart too, the former Soviet Union. Where is the accountability for the crimes committed during the Civil War in Spain? Where the accountability for the crimes committed during Stalinist years and beyond the Stalinist years? Time and silence make me very heavy-hearted. What can we do? Truth commissions, trials, lustration, for example, another topic that really, truly makes me wonder so much. Lustration in the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia, lustration in Poland, lustration in Hungary, and the Constitutional Court in Hungary playing such an important role. What about that? Obviously, I'm not asking you a pointed question. I'm sharing with you some of my thoughts, what's in my heart and my mind.
I wish I had an answer for you, because I can tell you this.
Let's forget amnesty. Let's forget. In Poland, some commentators have said, amnesty with amnesia. We cannot forget, but let's just move on. It's too long, too late.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, I don't know whether you know, but in Spain recently, in the last few years, there's been a movement to at least try to get compensation. I was surprised that nothing happened when Franco fell, because I think there is a belief in some quarters that if you establish a Truth Commission, you create problems. In my mind, it's just the opposite. These problems have a way of festering. And you see now in Argentina even what is happening. It's too late, I think, in some countries. I think even in Russia it would have made much more sense if there had been a Truth Commission or a national investigation of what happened during the Stalinist era, and some of the problems they're having these days may be due to the fact that this did not happen. So I'm a strong believer in not sweeping things under the rug in the hope that everything will be fine and people are going to forget. People don't forget. They want the truth, and that's what is going to bring about national reconciliation. So I'm with you. I think it's too late in many countries. But even the compensation in Spain would help. I should tell you, from my own point of view, that I've been very much impressed with the way the Germans handled things after the war. First of all, they've admitted what had happened, and they've provided compensation. And compensation it's not the money, but it is the money for some people, and I can tell you from my own experience, my mother would have been totally penniless if it hadn't been for the compensation that we received from the German government. It's not that that does away with what they did to us, but it was something that at least there was something. In many countries there was nothing of this sort. And I must say, the German, at least in West Germany, the educational process has been such that they try to teach in schools what happened during the war. It wasn't true in the east of Germany. It wasn't true in Austria. In Japan, they still have the problems, and of course you know what is happening in Turkey. So I at least am one who believes that if a country faces up to some of these problems, at least that is something that is very important to the victims. Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm just curious as to what the upshot of your work and your investigation has led to in El Salvador. It's like, are the people able to have their needs met, and are they free to live their life as they wish to, as a result of your work after the peace treaty was concluded? Are there still skirmishes between the death squads and the FMLN?
Yeah.
What is the current situation in the country of El Salvador?
First of all, I can tell you that in El Salvador you today have in the parliament representatives of the former insurgents, the FMLN, they have their own political party. They are members of parliament. They have one of the leaders of the FMLN, who recently died, had been mayor of San Salvador. The two, politically, the skirmishes are over. That's not a problem. The problem that has come to El Salvador is common criminals. And incidentally, the gangs who were exported out from Los Angeles ended up in El Salvador and developed some tremendous gangs. So common crime is a very serious problem in El Salvador, but no longer a political problem. So in that sense, we take some credit for what we did. Economically, the situation is so-so. It's a poor country. People are certainly not worse off than they were. The Salvadorans are a very resilient people, very hard-working people. You know, you have many immigrants here who send money back to Salvador. I think something like $4 billion a year come from very hard earnings. So people live, I think, a better life, but at least politically, the war is over. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been looking in the wrong direction, please, and then I'll take you.
I just had a question because you had talked about the micro and macro levels.
I'm sorry.
You talked about the micro and macro levels. So when people are telling you their individual stories, that's on a micro level. And I would assume that includes some sort of want for vengeance or retribution of some sort. So how do you make that shift, I guess, to the macro level, which is more, I would think, more useful in terms of the commission? And a second question, sorry. You had mentioned, you had recommended some ways to encourage reconciliation. So I was wondering if you could just mention a few of the recommendations that you had.
Yes. First of all, thank you. What we did, in addition to our report, we had 2 volumes of annexes in which we listed all the names of people who had been victimized in one way or the other. We, of course, also mentioned what happened in various places where people, from the El Mosata massacre to a number of other massacres. In El Mosata, there was only 1 survivor, if I remember correctly. And I should tell you, El Mosata always brings up something in me, because when that 1 survivor, a woman who had seen her children and family killed, began to talk about what had happened there, I could have finished the story for her. My own experience in the concentration camp, and actually in the ghetto at that point, I could have finished it, told her exactly how it happened. I've always been fascinated by the fact that we, as human beings, we are very lacking in creativity in our cruelty. We always do the same thing. When you read Solzhenitsyn about what was happening in the Gulag, it was very similar to what I experienced in Auschwitz or in Sachsenhausen. So we tried whenever we could describe what happened to people in different villages where there were massacres and so forth. We recommended, incidentally, a monument to all the victims of the Civil War. We recommended compensation. We actually recommended also that some of the funding that would come from abroad, that at least 1% should be set up for compensation. Unfortunately, in that area, very little has been done.
I was interested in one of the earlier comments about Spain, and I wanted to probe you a little bit further on that. One of the ironies about Spain is that while it had no truth commission or courts for its own past under Francoism, in the 90s, Spanish prosecutors started being the strongest proponents in the world, probably, of universal jurisdiction, and prompted perhaps further domestic prosecution in places like Argentina and Chile in response to Spain's own universalist prosecutions. I'm wondering whether you think that perhaps the universal jurisdiction prosecutions by the Spanish were kind of a metaphor for dealing with a Francoism that they never dealt with directly.
I must say, I've never thought of it that way. It's an interesting theory, and you may well be right. I thought you were going to ask me something else. How do you explain what happened in Spain? Because and I'll come back to you. I thought in Spain, the thing that saved Spain in some ways without a truth commission was the role of the king. The king performed a function which sort of guaranteed the constitutionalism that might very well not have come to fruition otherwise. What I also find interesting in Spain is, have you ever looked at the Constitution of Spain? It's probably the most international law-friendly constitution. It has a provision that says, it sets out various civil liberties in Spain, human rights. And then it says that in interpreting these provisions of the Spanish Constitution, it is up to the judiciary also to take into account the provisions of human rights treaties ratified by Spain. And then what you find is, since Spain has ratified the European Convention of Human Rights, and since the European Court of Human Rights has rendered a lot of judgments on almost every aspect of human rights guaranteed in the Spanish Constitution, the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, in fact, become federal jurisprudence for Spanish courts. And maybe, and here I come back to your question, maybe the way in which the Constitution is drafted and the role that judges have and the link that they have to the international community, to the Council of Europe, may have had some reason for what has happened in Spain. It's, of course, also surprising. They used to say that Spain, there would be a tremendous revolution after once Franco was dead. And they said in Portugal that wouldn't happen because in Portugal they don't kill the bull. But in Spain they kill the bull, and that would happen. Well, it didn't happen. And, of course, there was also no revolution in Portugal. I think you have to start.
That we're out of time because another class comes in a few minutes. But before we leave, I want to remind everybody that there is a lunch served across the hall. And at this point, I just want us all to join in and thank you very much for